Ra. I am Ra. I greet you in the love and the light of the one infinite creator. We communicate now. Questioner. In previous communications you have spoken of the mind-body-spirit complex totality. Would you please give us a definition of the mind-body-spirit complex totality? Ra. I am Ra. There is a dimension in which time does not have sway. In this dimension, the mind-body-spirit in its eternal dance of the present may be seen in totality, and before the mind-body-spirit complex, which then becomes a part of the social memory complex, is willingly absorbed into the allness of the one creator, the entity knows itself in its totality. This mind-body-spirit complex totality functions as, shall we say, a resource for what you perhaps would call the higher self. The higher self, in turn, is a resource for examining the distillations of third density experience and programming further experience. This is also true of densities 4, 5, and 6, with the mind-body-spirit complex totality coming into consciousness in the course of 7th density. Questioner. Then would the mind-body-spirit complex totality be responsible for programming changes in catalyst during, say, a third density experience of the mind-body-spirit complex, so that the proper catalyst would be added, shall we say, as conditions for that complex change during third density experience? Is this correct? Ra. I am Ra. This is incorrect. The higher self, as you call it, that is, that self which exists with full understanding of the accumulation of experiences of the entity, aids the entity in achieving healing of the experiences which have not been learned properly, and assists, as you have indicated, in further life experience programming, as you may call it. The mind-body-spirit complex totality is that which may be called upon by the higher self aspect, just as the mind-body-spirit complex calls upon the higher self. In the one case you have a structured situation within the space-time continuum, with the higher self having available to it the totality of experiences which have been collected by an entity, and a very firm grasp of the lessons to be learned in this density. The mind-body-spirit complex totality is, as the shifting sense, and is in some part a collection of parallel developments of the same entity. This information is made available to the higher self aspect. This aspect may then use these projected probability-possibility vortices in order to better aid in what you would call future life programming. Questioner. Out of the Seth material we have a statement here. Seth says that each entity here on Earth is one aspect or part of a higher self or oversoul which has many aspects or parts in many dimensions, all of which learn lessons which enable the higher self to progress in a balanced manner. Am I to understand from this, is it correct that there are, shall we say, possibly many experiences similar to the one that we experience here in the third density, that are governed by a single higher self? Is this correct? Ra. I am Ra. The correctness of this statement is variable. The more in balance an entity becomes, the less the probability vortices may need to be explored in parallel experiences. Questioner. Do I understand from this then that the higher self or oversoul may break down into numerous units, if the experiences required to what we would call simultaneously experience different types of catalyst, and then oversee these experiences? Ra. I am Ra. This is a statement we cannot say to be correct or incorrect due to the confusions of what you call time. True simultaneity is available only when all things are seen to be occurring at once. This overshadows the concept of which you speak. The concept of various parts of the being living experiences, of varying nature simultaneously, is not precisely accurate due to your understanding that this would indicate that this was occurring with true simultaneity. This is not the case. The cases from universe to universe and parallel existences can then be programmed by the higher self, given the information available from the mind-body-spirit complex totality regarding the probability-possibility vortices at any crux. Questioner. Could you give an example of an entity, possibly one from our historical past, possibly any entity that you might choose if you don't wish to name one, and give an example of how this type of programming by the higher self would then bring about the education through parallel experiences, please? Ra. I am Ra. Perhaps the simplest example of this apparent simultaneity of existence of two selves, which are in truth one self at the same time-space, is this. The oversoul, as you call it, or higher self, seems to exist simultaneously with the mind-body-spirit complex which it aids. This is not actually simultaneous, for the higher self is moving to the mind-body-spirit complex, as needed from a position in development of the entity which would be considered in the future of this entity. Questioner. Then the higher self operates from the future, as we understand things. In other words, my higher self would operate from what I consider to be my future. Is this correct? Ra. I am Ra. From the standpoint of your space-time, this is correct. Questioner. In that case, my higher self would, shall we say, have a very large advantage in knowing what was needed, since it would know, as far as I am concerned, what was going to happen. Is this correct? Ra. I am Ra. This is incorrect, in that this would be an abrogation of free will. The higher self aspect is aware of the lessons learned through the sixth density. The progress rate is fairly well understood. The choices which must be made to achieve the higher self as it is are in the provenance of the mind-body-spirit complex itself. Thus the higher self is like the map in which the destination is known. The roads are very well known, these roads being designed by intelligent infinity working through intelligent energy. However, the higher self aspect can program only for the lessons and certain predisposing limitations if it wishes. The remainder is completely the free choice of each entity. There is the perfect balance between the known and the unknown. Questioner. I'm sorry for having so much trouble with these concepts, but they are pretty difficult to translate, I am sure, into our understanding and language. Some of my questions may be rather ridiculous, but does this higher self have a physical vehicle, or some type of vehicle, like our physical vehicle? Does it have a bodily complex? Ra. I am Ra. This is correct. The higher self is of a certain advancement within sixth density going into the seventh. After the seventh has been well entered, the mind-body-spirit complex becomes so totally a mind-body-spirit complex totality that it begins to gather spiritual mass and approach the octave density. Thus the looking backwards is finished at that point. Questioner. Is the higher self of every entity of a sixth density nature? Ra. I am Ra. This is correct. This is an honored duty of self to self as one approaches seventh density. Questioner. Let me be sure I understand this then. We have spoken of certain particular individuals. For instance, we were speaking of George Patton in a previous communication. Then his higher self at the time of his incarnation, he was George Patton, about 40 years ago. His higher self was at that time sixth density. Is this correct? Ra. I am Ra. This is correct. We make note at this time that each entity has several beings upon which to call for inner support. Any of these may be taken by an entity to be the mind-body-spirit complex totality. However, this is not the case. The mind-body-spirit complex totality is a nebulous collection of all that may occur held in understanding. The higher self itself a projection or manifestation of mind-body-spirit complex totality, which then may communicate with the mind-body-spirit during the discarnate part of a cycle of rebirth, or during the incarnation may communicate if the proper pathways or channels through the roots of mind are opened.